Order. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. I'm Florence Eshalomi, the chair of the committee. Can I ask my colleagues on the committee to introduce themselves, please?
I'm Matt Ellis, I'm the MP for Ribble Valley.
I'm Nishaba Khan, I'm the MP for Gillingham and Rayner.
Sarah Smith, the MP for Hyndburn.
Joe Powell, Kensington and Bayswater.
Andrew Lewin, Welling Hatfield.
Will Forster, MP for Woking.
Lee Dillon, Newbury.
Lewis Coughlin, Broxbourne.
Agam Hindra, South West Hertfordshire.
Thank you, and to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, yes.
To welcome the Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary to our session this afternoon, looking at the spending review for the department. Obviously, there was some big figures announced for the department following the Chancellor's announcement 2.5 weeks ago, and it's good to see some of that investment coming into the areas we've been discussing. I just wanted to start off, Secretary of State, looking at the big announcement on social housing and the Affordable Homes Programme, which is something we've been looking at in a lot of detail at our committee. Some reports actually outlined, looking deeper and looking at the small print of what the Chancellor announced, that the bulk of that funding will be heavily backdated, and the spending review may only see about 4 million of that between up to 2029, 2030, 4 billion up to 2029-30. So just wanted to know how much of that 39 billion will be in the 10-year Social Affordable Homes Programme, and how many will be coming specifically during this Parliament.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much. As you know, we've been very busy since we last met. Lots of legislation going through Parliament, and also the spending review, which gave us, as you say, a huge boost of 39 billion over 10 years for social and affordable homes. We've made it clear that we'd like to see 60% figure on social rents within that. We've made a real push about that. That's us indicating to the market where we expect it to go. We don't go any further than that because obviously we want to maximise supply, and it very much depends on the sites and all the other changes that we're making. But as you say, Chair, 4 billion of that will be with it by the end of 2029-30. So we're maximising with all the other changes we're making, because I think you'll have noticed that when I was in opposition, I criticised the previous government for giving back £2 billion of the Affordable Homes Programme, and that's because they wasn't able to do the other pieces of work that we've been working on around planning reform, the National Planning Policy Framework, the mandatory targets, some of the work on acceleration with Section 106. There's lots of different things that need to oil, as I say, the chain to ensure we get the AHP out the door. But we've made no bones about it that we have social housing crisis in this country, and the reforms we're making to both right to buy, the rent convergence, and the indication to the market that we want to put more money into social rent at homes is giving them a clear indication of where we're going, but also a 10-year programme which will also stabilise them, because we've had a off-on start to funding, which means that things slow down and then speed up, and it's really difficult for the market then to produce a long-term goal of how we get to where we want to be.
Just on that then, so obviously you announced last week, going back to the social homes element, you announced last week that 60% of the new affordable homes will be for social rent. What modelling did you use to get to that figure?
Well, again, what we were saying is, again, within the AHP and what we believe the market could withstand, is we were saying that this is where we think you should get. We wouldn't go beyond that because, again, a number of factors do depend on that, which is around what sites are available, etc., and some of the other changes that we're making. But I think that what we're trying to do is stimulate the market and be very clear on what we want to do. So we've announced, I think it was £12 million investment for local councils to be able to build council homes, for example, and some of the low interest loans for them to be able to do that alongside the rent convergence, which we believe will be able to ramp up the market. But it's really difficult to pin it down, and I don't mean to be I don't really mean to be difficult on this, Chair, but there's a lot of different factors that can be at play. But what I'm trying to do as Secretary of State is give confidence to the market, but also indicate what I think is a target of where we should be reasonably expecting them to deliver.
Just on that 60% going back that you mentioned then, will that count towards your overall 1.5 million target, or is it in addition to the 1.5
No,
million
it's
target?
within the 1.5
So it's
million
within the
homes
1.5
target,
million.
yes.
So I don't know if you're aware of the Children's Commissioner's report today in The Guardian, where it outlines some really stark realities of children across England. The fact that we have 4.5 million children in poverty, living in poverty, up to April last year. And I just wanted to read a quote from the report to you, Secretary of State, where it talks about the impact of poverty on some of those young children. It said, from the research, they spoke with candour about the things that most people would consider basic, but which for them are out of reach. A safe home that isn't mouldy, full of rats, a big bed enough to stretch out in, basic food like bacon, a place to do their homework, having the heating on, privacy in a bathroom and then being able to wash, having their friends over and not having to travel hours to school, or having a local park to play where the grass isn't overgrown and unusable. The fact is, Secretary of State, we are going to build these homes hopefully to help those children. That will take time. But what's not helping those children now, linked to the fact that we won't see those homes being built tomorrow, is the freeze on the local housing allowance. That is continuing to push many families and children into poverty. Is the case still being made to have the local housing allowance reviewed?
Well, what I would say, Chair, is at the forefront of my mind in everything that I do, not least the pressures surrounding local government and some of the fundamental services they provide to children and young people, is the housing crisis that we've got. And we've got 165,000 children in temporary accommodation, and that's not acceptable in our country to be in those circumstances. And I've met with Arab's family a number of times about how we ended up in a situation where a young child lost his life because of the housing conditions that they faced. So there's been a number of priorities and pressures that we've been trying to alleviate. The work we're doing on homelessness, the building the homes that we desperately need, the work that we're doing to challenge landlords to make sure their houses are fit and habitable. But equally, there are also other pressures that families face. The government spends £34 billion per year on housing support, including £12 billion in private rental sector. And the local housing allowance rates were last increased in April of 2024, and that's £7 billion over 5 years. Look, I'm not here to defend the crisis that we inherited. What I'm saying is it will take us time to alleviate some of those pressures, but what I've focused on is both short-term in providing support to families, and we've done that across government, including with the Employment Rights Bill, the free breakfast clubs, the rollout of free school meals, as well as the over 3 million people getting an instant pay rise because of the changes we made to the minimum wage. And then longer term, looking at, the only way we're going to fix this crisis is not by giving more money to private landlords for people who should be in social housing. We need to have a social housing revolution, and that is why I've been so bold as to push for the biggest amount of increase in the affordable homes programme alongside the rent convergence, which the market will tell you they've really welcomed this because they've been asking for years for us to make these changes, and previous governments have not allowed that to happen. We're very clear that we've got a short-term deal with the pressures that families face, and that's around the cost of living as well. But in the long term, the only solution to the housing crisis in this country is to build more homes. And I sat on a platform, a manifesto to do that. And I think the last 12 months have proven that I mean what I say and I say what I mean. And we've brought forward many changes, including the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which is going through Parliament now, the National Planning Policy Framework, the large amount of investment the government is putting into housing is showing that actually we mean business. But it's not going to turn around overnight. But we are alleviating short-term pressures at the same time as we've got to fix this crisis in the long term as well.
We are, and that's the long term, but with all due respect, Secretary of State, data is showing a massive decline in house building starts. The sector is saying they do not have the skills and the workforce. A number of builders are saying that they do not have confidence because some of the regulation, which they rightly welcome on building safety, is holding up those houses coming forward. When you've got data and a report from the IPPR in January this year showing that 90,000 families will be pushed into poverty because of the shortfall in the local housing allowance, is that not a political choice by the government to continue to freeze that and push those children into poverty?
Well, I think it's important to state that any further decisions, like I say, we've already put £34 billion a year into housing support, and we've increased that in April of 2024. But the decisions on local housing allowance will be made in the round at the budget alongside the other decisions that the government have already made, which is it has had an impact on families. We're rolling out in September more childcare places and more support for families in work. And families will tell you the cost of childcare and the support around the school meals, the school uniforms, the breakfast clubs, these will all have an impact in the round, including the work that we've been doing on the Employment Rights Bill, which will give families more security as well. I think that you can't take one in isolation. A government has to have a number of priorities. We are investing in putting money into local housing allowance, but the truth is that the way to fix this problem is not by rents increasing significantly by having private landlords that are putting social tenants in private landlord accommodation. The way to fix this problem is by having more social housing for people that desperately need it.
It is. And just finally on that, again, even when the National Residential Landlords Association are telling us about the impact of local housing allowance, the very same children that we need to be in the breakfast clubs, their parents who need the jobs from the Employment Rights Bill, the flexibility they will get from being able to request flexible working, the jobs that will be created, the many millions of people that will see their wage increase from the increase in the minimum wage, they all still need a place to sleep.
That's right.
And that's not going to happen because we can't build the homes fast enough. So in the interim, they are renting within the private rented sector. But a lot of them are not able to rent locally because of the freeze on the local housing allowance.
I think, again, Chair, what we've done on top of that is the Renters' Rights Bill, which is protecting many, and the homelessness prevention and the extra money that we've set aside for that, which local councils can look at some of that and ways of preventing homelessness as well, but also around ending Section 21 no-fault evictions and some of the challenges that families face that lead them to homelessness in the first place, which we've seen where landlords will evict people, families with no excuse, and then we'll ramp up the rent and put somebody in because the housing market is in such a dire situation. So we've been taking measures to try and prevent some of those egregious type of practices at the same time as building the homes that we need and supporting families now through a number of measures to alleviate the pressures, the financial pressures that they're under. But the rents is one element of pressures on families, but there's a whole host of other pressures that families are facing, which we're trying to support them with as well.
Well,
thank you, Chairman. Deputy Prime Minister, I do welcome the £39 billion investment in affordable and social housing, but given in my constituency of Woking, and actually the Chairman's constituency, it costs at least £200,000 to build a home in the UK. That's roughly 300 affordable homes in the country across each constituency. That's clearly not enough to meet the demand. Why has the government gone for the £39 billion figure? Is it what you genuinely think you can afford rather than what we as a country need?
Well, the country will need way more than what we can give them in terms of housing, but there again, being able to have the construction, to have the facilities to enable to get us to that place is a fine balance. One of the things that has been said to me, relax 106 notices and people can build, and it's, well, no, we need to build communities, so you've got to have the infrastructure in place. That takes time, so that's a figure and the amount we've got, which I believe will be able to create not just houses, but homes and communities, which are incredibly important as part of that. And also, like I said before, challenging the private rental sector as well with the measures we're taking in the Renters' Rights Bill to protect those renters at the moment, which I don't feel the protection has been there for them, which has left them feeling even more vulnerable. So I think that this will make a huge impact. But we have to remember the reason we've got into this mess is for over a decade and a half, we haven't grasped the nettle on this issue. We haven't dealt with the long-term problems of the housing crisis, and we are starting to turn that around. And I think there has been a national conversation about this now, because I don't think there's a family in this country that doesn't know somebody in their family that have got a housing need that isn't being met. And we are working to deliver that, whether that's through the additional money we're putting into skills. We've got an industrial strategy and a skills strategy, which is identifying where we've got skills gaps so we can produce the infrastructure and the homes we need going forward on the government's programme, but also about how we not only get the money for investment in housing, but how we bring that about, whether that's through the National Housing Bank, through financial tractions, through the Affordable Homes programme, through the rent convergence. There's so many different elements, the mandatory housing targets for local authorities that we've brought back in so that they are planning where the housing and infrastructure needs to be in their communities. There's a lot of moving parts that we've grasped the nettle in the first 12 months to say we're going to do it. And I think if you speak to people in the sector, whether that's from homelessness all the way through to developers, they will say they will welcome the changes that we're making. Even local authorities who are concerned about their mandatory targets have recognised that we need to do something, because we haven't for the last decade.
Thank you. Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Deputy Prime Minister, so you've said you do what you say. So can you tell us then, since the July elections, you've been in post now 12 months, how many planning permissions have been granted in the last 12 months for social homes, and how many of those social homes have started construction on site since you've been Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, I can't give you the granular detail of every single planning application, but what I can tell you is that we're monitoring what happens. I've done a number of call-ins. My department set up a specialist group that will help New Homes Accelerator. We are supporting councils with their negotiations on 106 notices to get more social and affordable homes as part of development. So we are looking at where the problems are with getting these houses and mixed tenure off the ground, and are really pushing them. So we've already unlocked thousands of homes that the previous government wasn't able to deliver. But I can't give you the granite detail of every single planning application that we've had over 12 months.
You just said you were tracking it. So if you're tracking it, surely you should be able to say over the last 12 months we've granted planning permission for 10,000 houses and 4,000 have started on site. So you can't be tracking it if you haven't got those figures.
Is it worth me coming in here just to say, obviously we track overall planning permissions, but those are all granted at local level, so we can definitely look at kind of whether we can specify exactly how those break down between types of housing.
That's something you could probably write to us as a committee
yeah,
about.
But I think it's probably worth saying, you know, even in a situation where considering all of the different reforms that we've put into place, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see those filtering through in those numbers quite yet. And I think that goes back to what the Chair said at the beginning about housing starts and the fact that housing starts are still lagging behind where we would want them to be. But that is because there is a considerable lead time between the time of making these policy changes and actually seeing both planning permissions and housing starts following through.
Planning permissions are up 6%. That is something that we've already seen between January and March of 2025. Planning applications were up 6% from the same quarter last year. So that is sort of like the first indication of dealing with what was an inheritance of housing and applications going off a cliff, basically, under the previous government, of some of the reforms we've introduced. Well, it is true. I mean, the statistics were really clear, and we're turning that around now, and we're starting to see that planning applications are going through. The planning infrastructure bill, which is still not, you know, it's still in Parliament at the moment. They have some good reforms in there that will help planning applications as well, and we'll get those starts. I've talked about the New Homes Accelerator, which we've unblocked thousands of homes that were stuck in the system. The issues around neutrality, the issues around making sure that the infrastructure like reservoir and water is there. These things were not even in the pipeline under the previous government, and we've started to grasp that nettle through the reforms that we're making, including telling local authorities we're bringing back mandatory housing targets, which the previous government didn't do. We'll start to make sure that there is a real important carrot and stick for people to say we have to have these homes. And I think in fairness, the government said this in opposition. We were elected on a mandate to do it, and people understand it. But going back to my previous point that I made before, and the tension is that they gave me a mandate to build the houses, but they said quite categorically that they wanted input, and that's why mandatory housing targets are important, because then they have to consult on that with local people, but they want the infrastructure within that as well, and I think that's the big challenge, and that's what we're delivering.
In the planning and infrastructure bill makes infrastructure first, makes the roads come first, makes the doctors' surgeries come first, makes the schools come first, because I couldn't find it. So can you tell us, as Secretary of State, then, what in the planning and infrastructure bill makes infrastructure on development come first?
Well, first of all, the stuff, it's not the planning infrastructure. The infrastructure in the planning infrastructure bill is things like the nature recovery and dealing with things like nutrient neutrality and around streamlining planning. So planning applications, they can focus on the more contentious areas where you do need to then thrash out, as part of the planning process, the critical infrastructure that is needed. The role that we're playing across government through national infrastructure as well, and working with other departments, is about if there is a school or a hospital or roads, we're already investing in transport, significant amount of investment in transport that the previous government didn't do, and that is around making sure that if we're planning new towns, for example, or we're doing significant amounts of housing in an area, that infrastructure comes as part of that programme. Now that takes time to do. I'm not going to have been able to do that in 12 months, you can appreciate that, but we're already doing that work, and we're already holding developers to account, which again the previous government didn't have a way of doing that, which at the moment people were frustrated that developers would come back after agreeing a programme of infrastructure and then say, well, we can't deliver that, and we're already now holding them to account to say, you've promised that as part of the development, we're going to make sure that happens, and we're supporting local authorities in making sure they do that, because that's the buy-in that you'll get from the public with this. They know we need the houses, but they say we want to have a say in where they are, and we want to make sure the infrastructure is there as part of that, and I am absolutely clear on that mandate being caveated on those two conditions.
Okay, thank you. Just coming back to some of the points Lewis highlighted there, Secretary of State, and back to my other question around the fact that house building starts are quite low and a decline. What makes you confident that you will still hit your 1.5 million target during the course of this Parliament? Obviously, we've just celebrated 1 year last week. You've got 4 years left.
Yeah. So I'm listening to what the market is saying. I meet with them regularly, meet with developers, I meet with local authorities, and I'm tracking where we're at. As I said, the planning applications are up by 6% in the same quarter. That's the first indicator. We will start to get more data as we get into the autumn around starts and whether or not that's done enough. People have already welcomed the National Planning Policy Framework changes. They were the only ones that, in effect, kicked in. And even the OBR scored it in the score chart because they could see that that would deliver growth and speed up housing. We've made changes. We have a ministerial team that works with the sector on skills, and they're confident that they can meet the skills challenge to ramp up house building. And the planning and infrastructure bill that is in the Parliament at the moment will then also streamline some of the planning challenges that we face, so that we can ensure that where there is more thorny issues and more contentious planning, that has the planning whole committee, but that where there isn't, and we want to build out, so we've made announcements on supporting SMEs, the brownfield passport, which again will enable brownfield sites to come online much quicker, and supporting some of the remediation that may be needed to make sure that we have the brownfield first approach. So it's not just about saying we expect you to use brownfield first, it's about saying we will help remediate, we will support you by streamlining the planning process, and we will deliver by supporting SMEs, for example, with finances, which they again said financing upfront to be able to deliver on these sites is hard for them. We're already making changes that will support them in that process. So I'm confident that we can get there. It is a stretch target though, and I said that right from the beginning of this, that everything has to be going in the right direction with the wind behind us to get to 1.5 million homes. But I think Mr. Foster and others have already alluded to it, that even with the 1.5 million homes target, that is still not going to fix everything that's wrong in the housing situation in this country. But what I hope by the end of this Parliament is you will see a massive big line that's going up in the right direction, that you can't stop it, that it's going to continue even if I don't, that you will see that line in the right way.
Lee, very quickly, please.
It was just, so I absolutely accept, Deputy Prime Minister, that you need a multitude of attack angles to get to that 1.5. The housing strategy that's promised at the end of the year, your ministers have also said about bringing all of those different levers together into that document. Will that signpost what it expects each of those levers to be able to deliver in their own right? Or again, will it just be that holistic, and so all of this will deliver the 1.5 and will be tenure blind in the housing strategy?
I think it depends on what you want by your granular detail. It will not be an airy fairy look, this is what we want, moon on a stick, but it will set the tone of where we want to get to and how we think we'll deliver that. And I suppose that's why at the spending review, not only did we announce the overall target in terms of the 39 billion investment, but we also announced a number of measures, like we gave a nod and a wink to rent convergence, which we're consulting on at the moment. That was to give confidence to the sector, because this stop-start that happens when they think, oh, it might not happen, it will, is giving them the confidence to do that. And it was the same with the 60% on affordable rents. It's again telling the market, indicating to them, the same with the warm homes funding. It's the same with some of the stuff we're doing on decent home standards. It's about giving them an idea of where we're going and a 10-year plan, so that they can then have the stability which we haven't had previously, for them to then go forward with confidence that we're matching their ambition.
Thank you. Gagan, really quickly.
We have a very quick question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. I think part of the line of questioning has been, how do we as a select committee track your progress on this 1.5 million ambition? Because we don't want to get to 2029 and realise we've not. So our role is very much to scrutinise your work. What reassurance can you give us that we will have that information in a timely manner, in a way that we can understand it, and therefore challenge you as Deputy Prime Minister and Secretary of State?
I mean, that's a fair point, and I'll let the permanent set come in as well, because the civil service probably give you a less political answer than I would on this. But, you know, there's plenty of data out there. As I say, you know, the 6% up on planning applications is a real good start.
We've had 1 million planning applications that were not fulfilled in the previous.
Sure, but if you look at some of the ones that were stuck in the system, again, I've just said thousands of them we've unlocked with some of the other changes that we've made. There's a number of different indicators of data that can give you an idea of where we're going. But I've said it to the Chancellor, I've said it to the Prime Minister, I've said it to every single cabinet member, that the only time we've built at this level before in the past is after the Second World War, and the only reason we were able to build at that sort of level is because the state put that investment in. And that's why you saw from the Chancellor the commitment around all the other measures we've made around rent convergence, around supporting. So, for example, Arab's Law, the hazards that are a threat to life, we brought them in, we set the regulations the other week, and they'll come in October. But some of the secondary ones around decent homes, we staggered them, because the landlords were saying we couldn't do this as well as match what you want on house building. And therefore I had to take a decision to say, people should live in a safe home. It shouldn't risk your life to live in a home. But some of the other issues, like overcrowding, for example, if I tried to fix that now, we'd have an even bigger housing crisis. Yeah. So it was a balance to be had. But you will see, and I'll let the Permanent Secretary see, there is lots of data points that you can challenge us on with the changes that we're making. But we expect within 2027, 28, you should start to see that really ramp up with the changes we're making.
Yeah, so I mean, just to endorse really what the Deputy Prime Minister said, I mean, the moment the data that you will see most sensitively kind of changing is applications, because that's obviously step one. People have seen the changes in the National Planning Policy Framework from December and will have been working on that basis to apply on the basis of the planning rules set out in that. So you've seen applications go up in the first quarter of this year. That's really good news. Those then obviously have to translate into approvals. So planning permissions being approved, that is also data that can be tracked in order to see that the 6% increase in applications is also kind of following through with an increase in the numbers that are approved. As you say quite rightly, that doesn't always follow into build out, though we have taken a number of steps in order to be clear that if planning permissions are not built out in the long term, kind of we will intervene and take action against developers that are not building on the land that they have planning permission to build on. And The housing starts is then obviously the kind of next stage, and because all of the planning permissions granted for the current housing starts were before any of the planning changes that we've made, that and plus all of the difficulty with the market conditions, meaning that housing starts are at such a low at present. Obviously, as the Deputy Prime Minister said, if we don't see an increase in those pieces of information in that order, we will start being concerned that we aren't seeing the boost that we really, really need to see and that we are expecting to see through all of the policy changes that we're making.
When will we as a committee know that those benchmark points have been reached?
Well, I think next time, we're in front of you, kind of we can go through the data that has been published, and you'll be able to see it kind of as national data about what has happened with planning permissions, what's happened with approvals.
Maybe we can look at how to formalise getting timely and accurate data on a regular basis. That would be helpful. Thank you. Joe.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Prime Minister, could we look at how the Affordable Homes Programme will be spent? So I think the first question is, with the 60% target for outputs in terms of social rent, is that have you looked at how much is it also going to be 60% of the programme that will be spent on social rent?
I think it very much depends, because it depends on the development. And so, for example, if we were looking at a build out as part of our grey belt rules, there is more tight and stringent ways to which that can be developed in certain areas. So there's a number of factors that would depend on, as that planning application comes through, it would very much depend on what the size of the development is and how much. So, for example, in some areas of the country, land is more expensive than others, and the capital cost of bricks and everything is the same wherever it is. So, depending on where it is, would depend on how much you can then demand and utilise, and the remediation, for example, of a site could have an impact as well. So, there's a couple of moving parts. But what we've been really clear on, and what we've tried to do over the last 12 months, is strengthen that kind of situation where local authorities in the first instance are the ones that are negotiating with the social owners. So we're strengthening the hands of working with Homes England to look at how they can support the grant funding, but also strengthening the hands of local authorities and supporting social landlords in buying in and being part of that development process to make sure we're getting value for money, because we haven't always got that, and I'm sure people have seen evidence of that where it's been in the press and others where there's been a development and there's been barely any social housing on that, and we've been very clear that that's not acceptable and we want to see more of it.
And one of the things that we've heard in previous sessions on this committee is the non-social part of the package, so the affordable, other types of affordable product. For example, last week we heard some really shocking examples around older people's shared ownership. What assessment are you doing of value for money around those different shared ownership models, because they vary widely, and what role would you see that for the 40% which is not social?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing some work on that, and full details will be set out in the autumn, but we have been looking at different types of models, whether it's affordable shared ownership. We're also looking at announcing a permanent mortgage guarantee scheme in the coming months, which again is, developers will say, well, I'll only build the houses if people can afford them, and etc. So making sure that people can afford the houses, and therefore developers have confidence that they can build the houses at the scale that we want them to build them. So, but we will be coming forward in the autumn with more details about how the sort of tenure and the remaining tenures of housing would be developed.
Is that the housing strategy, the long-term housing strategy?
Yeah, the long-term housing strategy is part of that, but this is another piece of work that we're doing, I think, which is separate to that.
Yeah, and also, obviously, the new Affordable Homes Programme will be subject to thorough business case analysis for value for money, the way that any programme of this kind of size and nature would be in government.
I mean, you can watch back the evidence, but we heard from examples that on first sight would not feel like value for taxpayer money to be invested into some of the providers of those schemes. So I think we're just looking for some reassurance that we'll learn the lessons from the previous programme, because it is taxpayers' money going to these developers to do shared ownership.
Yeah.
And then, Deputy Prime Minister, you've mentioned a few times on council housing itself. Now, a lot of councils will say we welcome the grant money, but there are other things that they're looking for example, more flexibility around the housing revenue account, looking at those 2012 changes, being able to support them in other ways. Will you be looking at that too?
In the short, yes, we are. We are looking at that. We are looking at low interest loans. We're looking at, so for example, the work we've done on some of the restrictions, reversing some of the 2012 changes to right to buy and around new homes, so giving them confidence that if you're putting capital up to build council housing, that it's not going to disappear within a number of years, but the principle of right to buy remains for those that have lived in their houses for years and have paid their rents and that's their home. We believe that that is the right balance. Also around the support that we're giving through the Local Government Association around gearing councils up, there is an appetite. And it's not just from one particular party or politics. There is an appetite from local government and local councils to build council housing because it is one of their biggest cost pressures, which comes back to the Chair's point before around local housing allowance and temporary accommodation. It's one of their biggest cost pressures beyond things like children's services, that councils feel frustrated that they're not able to deal with that pressure. So there is a lot of buy-in from them, and we've been doing a lot of consultation and a lot of support to them to provide them with the fertile ground as well as the expertise to start ramping up council housing, as well as the social housing providers that we work with as well, who many of them provide specialist housing. You mentioned before about older people's accommodation, supported tenancies, a number of different tenures that we need to again look at and focus on because we've got a shortage of those.
Just final question from me is from those shared ownership are obviously a component of the 4.8 million leasehold properties we have around the country. You can obviously understand why those leaseholders who have been promised change for many decades keep a very close eye on whether they feel like the government is on track to deliver its manifesto commitment. Do you feel like the government is on track, and when do you think we can actually expect to see the end of this leasehold system entirely?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is the previous government tried to do something on this, in fairness. They recognised the problem. The legislation that we inherited has some fundamental flaws and needs some changes to it and some tweaks, and that's what my housing minister has been working through. We are absolutely clear the Law Commission's recommendations need to be implemented, and we need to move away from the feudal system that we inherited to a common hold system, and I think that's starting to have an impact on the market already, on what houses are available now and what the tenure of leasehold is. You can see that already, but we will be producing the draft legislation by the end of this year to ensure that by the end of this Parliament that we deal with some of the leasehold challenges, and you'll have seen announcements just this week on that. I think the challenge and even fair is that it's fraught with legality, and some of the fine minutiae points of it have to be dealt with care, and we're going through that because I think the previous government saw the problem, was trying to fix the problem, but we ended up with quite a few snags in the way in which that legislation was designed, and that was because at haste they were trying to solve the problem, without putting words in my mouth, but at haste they were trying to solve a problem that was a genuine challenge. But I think the one thing that the lesson I took from that is don't act in haste and then repent at leisure, because you'll end up causing more problems. So we're working with the sector and we will introduce the recommendations of the Law Commission, and we will do what we said in our manifesto, and we will do that by the end of this Parliament.
Just wanted to clarify on that, Secretary of State. So obviously the prospectus for the new social housing is going to be launched, and you'll call for bids later on this year. When is the long-term housing strategy going to be published?
The long-term housing strategy is due to be published later this year as well. We've set that target to make sure that we deliver on that.
We've got long-term housing strategy later this year, leasehold later this year.
Yes.
It won't be 31st of December this year.
No, because I think my housing minister wants to have some form of Christmas, Chair. And if I want to keep on his good books, bearing in mind how much work I've set my department, I mean, half of legislation going through Parliament at the moment is my department. So my ministers and my civil service are doing a tremendous job, and I am very pleased with the pace, and I understand that there is frustration with the pace, but if you contextualise it in half of legislation going through Parliament at the moment is from my department, you will see that we are not sitting around and not doing that, and we don't want a bottleneck at the end of this year, so we are not planning on throwing a load of announcements out on New Year's Eve. I think I should give my ministers a day off on that day.
We've got confirmation of that from you, Secretary. Thank you. Moving on to financial investment, Andrew.
Brilliant, thank you. If you don't mind, Chair, before I go to my substantive question about financial investment and the spending review, a quick follow-up, if I can, on shared ownership. Colleagues in the Select Committee may know, because I've referenced it before, I was a beneficiary of shared ownership. It was how I was able to get on the housing ladder. For me, it was a success, and I come from a starting point that there's got to be a role for low-cost home ownership for people who are aspirational. At the same time, we've heard so many stories of it not working. Yep. People feeling trapped, people saying, I'm compelled to buy the biggest share that I can. And I guess my follow-up question was for you, Deputy Prime Minister, do you think the system needs reform before there'll be any more beneficiaries under the next round of AHP?
I think we have to look at the lessons learned on shared ownership. As you say, for some it was a lifeline to get them on the property ladder. For others it's been entrapment. And also it's how it affected the housing market. And some of the schemes that were put in place before, I would argue, didn't actually enable, it made house prices go up at a higher rate actually and price more people out of the housing market. If you look at the how much it costs now to buy a house compared to average earnings, it is, I mean, when I was first looking at getting a house, it was 4 times your income. Now 8 times your income if you're lucky. So we have to, you know, look at that. What we want to try and do is move towards the full mortgage guarantee scheme, so that people, and we've also seen through the financial sector that they're also relaxing, for example, people that have not got that work in different type of hours and settings and different contracts. Before, they were never, if you were self-employed or on different types of contracts, you were never able to get a mortgage. Now we're seeing where the pendulum had swung too far the other way. Now we're seeing, as I would say, a sort of softening of some of those issues through the work that we're trying to do, which will mean more people are able to get onto the property ladder. And I think those type of measures, learning the lessons of the past, much more sort of prudent than just sort of this, you know, some of the measures that have been taken in the past has only meant that house prices have gone up and priced people out of being part of that.
Great, thank you. So on to the spending review, there's a commitment to 4.8 billion of funding towards financial investments to invite private investment, and that's going to be overseen by Homes England. Mm-hmm. But we've heard a lot in this committee about how the housing market has become dominated by a small number of big players. So my hope and expectation is that there's a focus for that money to go towards the SME sector. Is that right? And how is the loan facility going to help, you know, turbocharge SME development? Yeah,
so the National Housing Bank is a new approach, and that will deliver the housing at scale. We're putting £16 billion of investment into that, and we think it will support the delivery of 500,000 homes over the lifetime of its investments and leveraging £53 billion of additional private investment. You're absolutely right to concentrate on SMEs, and one of the things which I alluded to in the previous answer was that SMEs have found it really difficult to get financing and to get loans. So we're hoping that with us having this National Housing Bank working through Homes England, that we'll be able to release some of those funds and be able to support SMEs in that pipeline, because we think they're an important part of building out, especially on some of these smaller sites. And you'll have seen some of the announcements we made around planning applications, for example, on less than 10 homes, less than 30 homes, 50 homes and above that.
The guarantees that are part of the National Housing Bank in particular, I think, are a really important part of this, where SMEs struggle to get financing without extra guarantees and backing from government. We found that a very successful way in the past to support SMEs being able to build more. The National Housing Bank adds extra financial flexibility so that we can do more of that, and as those loans, you know, work their way through, we can loan again because of the way that the financial flexibility is in the bank structure works.
Right. Thank you. And then final question from me, Chair, just diving a little bit into the numbers with the help of the clerks. I just want to get my understanding right on the numbers. So we just talked about the 4.8 billion. The spending review also talks about 2.5 billion for low interest rate loans for social housing providers exclusively. And then in the press release about the National Housing Bank, the figure is 6 billion over the course of the park. So lots of good money, lots of investment, but I do want to, it's important for us, I think as a committee, we have clarity about how those numbers interact and what's the total.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do my best
Okay.
to run through these as kind of clearly as I can, and if
Yeah.
I get anything kind of slightly wrong, then I will sort of obviously come back and let you know. But there are existing 6 billion of guarantees that Homes England have, but that would now fall within the purview of Homes England as a public sector financial institution. So that's the kind of switch there, that it would operate in that way, which would be different. 5.5 billion of new guarantee capacity. And then there is 4.8 billion, which is new financial transactions. But of course, there is already money coming in and out as income to Homes England, and that would make up the gap between that and the 8, is my understanding of it. But I will kind of obviously correct myself if I turn out to be not quite right on that one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, plus the low interest loans, obviously, for social housing providers.
Just in terms of timescales for when the National Housing Bank's going to be set up, what is there a rough estimate on?
Yeah, so a public sector financial institution of that nature needs to be started at the beginning of the financial year for technical reasons that please don't ask me any further questions about, because I can't answer them. And therefore we are doing everything in our power to ensure that this starts from financial year 26-27.
Thank you, Chairman. Deputy Prime Minister, what risk assessment has been made in respect of the expanded use of financial investments as a policy tool by your department? I think there's a reason why I, particularly on the committee, are asking. As the MP for Woking, the previous government lent the former administration of my local authority over £2 billion, which the government have started to say they know they're not going to get all of that money back from the Public Works Loan Board. Don't we risk making the same mistake again? What steps are you putting in place to ensure that scrutiny happens?
Yeah, I think if you look at the bank loan financing, which will be determined through the bank's investment strategy, if you look at what happens currently with Homes England, who currently do works in offering finance for development, they have a track record of over 90% of its loans funds, so the risk is quite minimal, especially when we're looking at housing and the situation we face there. So I think that with the investment strategy, with it being part of a banking sector overseen by Homes England, who already do that loan financing now, I think there is enough measures in place for us to, unlike some of the other ways in which things have been done in the past, I think there's some guardrails, if you like, to ensure that we're not in a risky situation like maybe we was in some other areas like COVID contracts and things like that. We're not in that field. We're in a field that is Homes England already do some of this loan financing, and there is a very low risk with that because there's a high return on the basis of the property and what we're developing and the demand which we're all talking about at the moment. So I think that there is the guardrails that are in place, and because of Homes England will be devising that bank and the strategy, the investment strategy, then I think that we would be fine. Unless you tell me otherwise and you think you've got a better idea of how to do it, then I think that there is enough safeguards in place to deliver that.
So, Deputy Minister, what I'm concerned is when my council doesn't repay Public Works Loans Board money, that falls into the Treasury budget. That's a cut from there. What happens when there are bad loans via the new bank? How is that going to impact your department's budget?
Well, the bank is they have the investment, so they have the money that we're putting in. There's 16 billion of investment we're putting in. We think that will leverage in 53 billion of private sector money, and they will make decisions on their loans based upon their risk factors and how they will get that back in much the same way as a commercial bank would do in the same circumstances. So I don't think that I don't see an impact on my department. That's why my department is not going to run a bank. It will be within Homes England, and it will be through their stringent rules that they already have experience of offering loans and doing this type of work. Not at the same scale, but they do that already and have a very in-depth knowledge of the housing market.
So you're saying that there's no risk for not anything being repaid and not having a financial impact on your department?
I mean, there's always kind of, obviously, when you loan money, kind of some of it doesn't come back. But our extensive experience of Homes England previous loans is that they've seen a well over 90% repayment rate. They will operate, obviously, within a control framework, the Financial Transactions Control Framework, in order to ensure that loans are made on a kind of sensible basis. But as I say, our experience thus far has been that, in fact, these transactions have actually ended up with a return to the taxpayer.
Okay, and you're confident in terms of the oversight on that, because it just...
That is some of the work that obviously needs to be done between now and launching the bank in April 2026, is to ensure that not only we have exactly the right skills in Homes England in order to deliver this, that we have the right control framework in Homes England in order to manage a set of transactions which are less annually limited than the work that they've done so far. That should actually improve the way that we loan money, because it means that we have greater flexibility to loan across years, and indeed to ensure that the right information is passing between the department and Homes England in order to understand the decisions being made.
But just to clarify on Will's point, in terms of any bad loans, the department will not be asked to raid the very small 39 billion
overall. It would only be in a circumstance where literally, like, all of them went bad, if you see what I mean, which we wouldn't anticipate happening. But this is the kind of thing that we have extensive experience of in government through the National Wealth Fund and other mechanisms of this nature, and we wouldn't be expecting to undertake highly risky lending at all.
I think that's something that we'll probably try and monitor once the bank is up and running, just to make sure that there are adequate oversight and safeguards on that. Sarah, Green Book.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Coming now to the Green Book review, Action 1 of the reforms announced at the spending review stated that the Treasury would work with your department to introduce place-based business cases. So just interested to know what conversations have started on that, and have you explored any place-based business case pilots at this stage?
They're about to embark on the pilots. There is a task force that I've been working on place-based business, which I actually think I get really excited about this Green Book reform, and it's a running joke in government because anyone shouts Green Book and I go yay, because I actually think as a Northern MP as well in particular, I think this has real benefits for looking at how we can look at mutual benefit projects in the same place, like the railway line, for example, that you may need alongside housing development, and these can all be assessed together. Whereas in the past, I think that we've not been able to get the best out of the Green Book because of the restrictions in it. I think the Treasury have recognised that, and this place-based approach will be much more in the round about how we can deliver instead of being in case by case, looking at in silos. And the Treasury are very much up for this challenge, and have been working with our department and other departments across the Department for Transport, NISTA, and we're piloting this approach in several locations, and I'm really excited about what this can deliver over the next number of years for areas that have in particular felt left behind or haven't really felt the benefits.
Details of those pilots coming before summer, or?
I haven't got a date for those pilots yet, but hopefully as soon as possible. But anyone who knows me in government knows that Green Book crosses my mouth on a regular basis, including with the Treasury, and they know that this is actually really quite an exciting programme that could actually unlock a lot of development in areas that haven't seen it before. So it is a hobby horse of mine, and I know that the Treasury have brought into this as a way of not just about providing growth, but you'll have heard the Chancellor on many occasions say is growth across all of the UK, not just growth in particular areas. It has to be growth that's meaningful, that delivers, and changes to the Green Book and doing this work is really important about at the end of this Parliament, whether people in Burnley, Brighton or in London or anywhere else can really see the change for them and their communities, and I think this is one way of unlocking that.
I mean, I think it's worth saying kind of obviously the changes to the Green Book only announced relatively recently. We've set up a task force that CLG sits on because of Deputy Prime Minister's interest in the Green Book and making sure that these place-based pilots work. I can't promise you we'll actually launch pilots before the summer, but it is working at pace to put those into place.
Thank you. And I do share your excitement because I hope that it will benefit places like Hyndburn. And the review recognised that there are huge inequalities in terms of like capacity and capability in different places in the country. So interested to really know what the department will be doing to address these inequalities, because places like Lancashire do have huge potential, but recognise that sometimes that capacity capability is lacking to be able to bring forward the compelling business cases that hopefully will lead to pilots and developments in this place-based approach in the future.
Yeah, and we're working with mayoral combined authorities on secondments and things like that, for example. So again, about how we can share expertise and make sure that people have that capacity to realise their full potential. So there's already a number of ways in which we're trying to support areas that want to build the capacity. And I think the biggest sort of cultural shift, and it's happening at a local authority level in particular, is that we've tried to have an attitude and a culture since I took over the department of you come to us with a problem and we'll try and find a solution. We won't bash you over the head and say, look, you've not been able to do it. We've kind of tried to have an open door approach, a non-partisan approach to saying, look, you want to help your communities, we want to help our communities. If we're not honest about the challenges we face, then we're not going to be able to plug the challenges. And I think that is a very different approach and an open approach to how we've addressed things like when councils are looking at extra financial support, when councils are saying we want to do this but we don't have the expertise. We've been working with local government association about where they are coming to us and saying we think we need to do more in this area. So we're trying to have an approach that enables them to deliver, and we've looked at secondments and building expertise that can be drawn in, because at a local level you can't always have that strategic expertise. So within my department, we've been looking at how we can build a level of expertise that people can say we would like that. And some mayoral authorities have been going a very long time as well, whereas others have only just got going. And we've seen that with the mayoral council, is where mayors, doesn't matter which political party they're from, they're sharing their knowledge of the evolution of how MCAs have been working, and therefore being able to deliver faster in areas that are, shall we say, just catching up on some of the pathfinders and the trailblazers that are taking things forward. So we have a number of pilots in a number of different areas like homelessness and with the MCAs, and more money and more autonomy going to them. And we're trying to foster a relationship that enables them to share expertise and to share the secondments and to work to make sure that we bring them up to speed on the areas that they're wanting to make progress on, because every local authority in the country can't have expertise in all these areas, and we recognise that.
And will those secondments also be offered to areas that are not mayoral and not yet on that trajectory? Because I think there is a risk here that we actually end up leaving some places further behind, and certainly Lancashire could be one of those places at risk. So is there also offerings to those that might be CCAs at this point or further behind on their devolution journey, so that they don't get left behind?
Yeah, we are trying to do that. Again, through the Local Government Association, we're giving more support on that. We've also got the non-mayoral model that's going forward, so combined authorities that are coming together, because we're pushing authorities to do that as well, is to think across boundaries to solve some of the challenges they face, whether that's on skills or whether that's on housing or transport. It's not a borough-wide, or it's not a footprint of a council. So we are trying to make councils look at that, and we're enabling them and supporting them with that process. You'll see it through local government reorganisation, which we've been working with them heavily on. But we're trying to have this mindset of we will support you, and we've used the LGA to do some of that work to build that capacity and that knowledge.
Thank you. On to the issue of local authority core spending. Please, start.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Deputy Prime Minister, do you accept that Council's core spending powers set out in the spending review settlement is because it's baked in council tax rises of 5%?
I don't accept that. I think there's a number of things that we're doing to support local authorities, including over £5 billion of new grant funding over the next 3 years. I accept the challenges that local authorities have faced over the period of austerity. We're fixing that. We're giving them longer term, so multi-year settlements which will support the work that they're doing. We got a huge amount of funding through the Transformation Fund to alleviate some of the pressures that council face in particular areas like homelessness, children's services, etc. But it is ultimately for local authorities to look at how they deal with their obviously their pressures that they have. But we have been doing a lot, including the Fair Funding Review, which have been promised for years and never delivered, around making sure that we fund councils on the basis of need. And I said that consistently, I think at 2 local government conferences to a whole of councillors across the country, regardless of their political persuasion, is that a government's responsibility, as far as I'm concerned, as the Secretary of State, is to fund councils on need. And we heard previously a leaked recording of the previous Prime Minister doing the complete opposite of that. What I'm trying to do now is review fair funding and making sure that we deliver that, including looking at how we account for rural settings, because rural areas have a particular challenge as well. So we're at the consultation that we're doing, we've done 3 consultations so far to make sure we get this right, but the consultation we're doing at the moment gives ideas about how we're going to capture that within this and make sure that councils have the funding they have. And some councils have huge reserves, others have had to go right down to the bone and are really struggling even to provide statutory services. So this is long overdue and we're grasping the nettle to deliver that.
The reason I use that phrase of baked in is the Chief Secretary to the Treasury was asked that at the Treasury Select Committee and said, yes, that is what we are doing as a government. So
look,
I think the departments need to have a coordinated response.
Yeah, but what I would say is...
Just before, Deputy Prime Minister, just in terms of the actual question is, so according to the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the buck has been passed on to local authorities to raise council tax. So what lobbying did your department do against the Treasury to say that those pressures should be alleviated through greater allocation of funding from central government?
Well, I've just outlined the extra £5 billion of new grant funding that the Treasury did give. And to be fair, and one of the things that the Treasury and myself and this government did is that we maintained the existing referendum principles from the previous government. And if you look at what's happened over the last decade or so, it's not a shock that council tax rises have happened, and more, I would say, at times have been more challenging for other areas because of the fair funding hasn't been right. So the funding and the allocation of funds, I would say, haven't been right. So we're putting more money into local authorities, but equally we're making sure the funding is fair, and we're consulting on making sure that those changes do not leave anywhere without the funding to provide for their services. Now, councils will make their own decision, but we've set that preset where it was previously, and we've maintained that because we do not want to see council tax rises for working people, and that's why we've put the money in and kept that break on, which, that one of the Conservative councils was publicly saying that we needed to take that break off, and we've said no, because we obviously don't want to see big rises in council tax for people.
Just on that, and coming back on Lee's point, on that specific point, Secretary of State, is it right and is it fair to say that the spending review doesn't actually include an increase in the core spending power, but it rather cuts it over the long period because it's the issue of the council tax increases bakes into that overall figure?
Well, in the first 4 years of this government, the government-funded spending power, which does not include council tax, will rise 8% in real terms compared to minus 24% in the first 4 years of the 2015 government. So it's not fair to say that we are not putting more money into councils. We are also listened, and we're giving multi-year settlements, which is something that councils have said they desperately need. We've invested in transformational funding to alleviate some of the pressures, so that councils who are saying, we've got ideas of how we can do things differently, but we haven't got the money because it's going out the door score every day on this. We need some pump priming to then deliver the savings further on. Councils are increasing the amount of money they've got, but the demand, because if we're not fixing some of the challenges they face and the fairer funding formula, unless we do those two things, you can keep throwing loads of money at them, but you're not getting the best value for the money that you're putting in. And councils acknowledge that and say, actually, so if you take children's services, for example, and children's homes, some of the most vulnerable, councils are saying we need some capital and some funding to alleviate some of those challenges we face. We're putting that investment, I think it's 25 million off memory, to deliver on that transformation so that they can provide better services and bring down the costs of those services that are not delivering for people at a local level.
I think the argument in terms of the fairness is by loading it onto council tax, which is a regressive taxation system that relies on data that's more than 30 years old, actually means that it's not based on the ability of, it's not based on someone's ability to pay, it's based on an old value of their house. So I think you could argue actually it's less fair asking for that contribution of core spending power to be topped up through local council tax. But I just want to come on, if I may, Deputy Prime Minister, just on to the dedicated schools grant and the pressure that that's putting on to local councils. My own council, West Berkshire, is quite small. It's 160,000 people. Last year, £17 million deficit on the high needs block. By the end of 27-28, they project that to be 73 million. And we're probably one of the smallest councils in the country. So, I shudder to think what Birmingham would have to have. And the LGA say that by the end of this financial year, it could be a £5 billion deficit. So could that problem not be solved this year? And when will the government commit to writing that off of councils' balance sheets?
Well, again, you'll have seen that we've extended the phased transition towards a reformed SEND system. We've put at least £760 million through the DFE of transformation fund allocation to reform the current special educational needs and disability SEND system, and over 4.7 billion extra per year for schools through the DFE. And as I say, we've extended the statutory schools, the dedicated schools grant override by 2 years till March 2028. That is the recognition of pump priming the process of getting, and I want to be really clear, this is about reforming the system to get better outcomes, which will also mean that the costs don't spiral at the rate that they are. And what we're doing is we're listening to what people have said, and I think it's fair. I've been at Prime Minister's Questions every week. I've taken it a few times, and there isn't a week that doesn't go by where a member of Parliament raises a concern about this issue. So we have to grasp the nettle, and we've put significant amount of funding in place now to do that transformation, with the consultees of making sure that people are reassured that this is about our fundamental purpose here is better outcomes for some of the most vulnerable children who are not being served well, and we're spending huge sums of money. So hopefully when we get this right, people will be reassured that their support is in place for people, for their child that needs it, and that we're providing better services, and that councils are at the driving seat of being able to deliver those core services. I mentioned before about children's homes. That is just one example of where vast sums of money is going out of the system and we're not delivering for the most vulnerable children.
And I think we all share that ambition, but there's still the £5 billion of debt to then deal with once you've improved the system going forward. But I think I'll probably use my time up.
I mean, it's just worth saying, kind of like, as well as the sort of fundamental reform of the system, we have said that we recognise the ongoing costs to local authorities, and we'll set out further the plans to address that in the provisional local government finance settlement later in the year.
Because that does have to be front and centre of what you're doing, because the reality is, Deputy Prime Minister's Permanent Sec, without that kicking that into the long grass for another 2 years, a number of local authorities will be presenting to you, to the department, Section 114 notices. That's the reality.
I'm acutely aware of what we inherited and the dedicated schools grant statutory override, and the concerns that were very much being sent to me from local authorities in the run-up to the spending review, and the sheer cliff edge that would leave them in. So it is a challenge. I recognise that not all local authorities can deal with that challenge within their own circumstances either. So as Permanent Secretary says, we are we're very alive to that problem, and we're trying to reform and support and invest in the service at the same time as dealing with the legacy that we've inherited.
So that's the legacy you've inherited in your investing. But going back to the Public Accounts Committee, they said, and I quote, "The Ministry doesn't know if the billions of pounds spent delivering services locally is resulting in better outcomes." What is the Ministry actually doing to rectify and actually address this now? Are we just throwing more money into a leaking pot and it's just coming out the other end? Whether it's on temporary accommodation, whether it's on send, whether it's on rough sleeping. These are key areas that local authorities up and down the country are still saying there are pressures. We recognise the 8% you've mentioned, Secretary of State, but 8% from the base of the inheritance that local authorities have seen cut over many years.
So in fairness, Chair, local authorities have already, with incredibly difficult circumstances, have already started to grasp some of this nettle, and there's some really good piloting that has gone on in particular areas. Now, one thing that works for one area, which might be a coastal area or a rural area, might not work for another area, but there's some really good innovation going on. We've put more money, we put 100 million into homelessness additional to help with piloting in 20 areas so that we can deliver a homelessness prevention programme, so that we're getting upstream of some of these issues. Again, in children's services, local authorities have been screaming for the opportunity to change this, and therefore the £760 million that the DFE are putting in and through the Transformation Fund will make a significant difference, so that I think it's fair that local authorities and people that work in the sector, they know what the problems are, they just haven't had the ability and the resources to turn that around, because you can't turn the tap off while you're trying to direct the water another way. So we've now been able to look at a transformational fund to work with them on that, and there is already work that has been ongoing. It's fair to say that where we've got mayors, they've taken particular interest in these areas where it's had a particular impact on them. This is not just a government imperative, it is an imperative for those that are delivering on those frontline services, and therefore the buy-in to create that change is already happening. And the fact that there is a government now that recognises those problems, are sharing in those problems, I think has been welcomed, and I think we'll start to see some real improvements, because as you rightly say, you can't just keep throwing money at it.
And I think it's fair to say you and your ministers recognise that. Do you feel that colleagues in Treasury recognise that?
I think they do, because they've put significant funding in place for transformation. They recognise the challenges that are faced, in particular around some of our frontline services. The pressures have increased post-COVID again. You'll see that in the NHS, for example. We had a target to have 2 million more appointments. We've now reached 4 million more appointments. We're investing in more GPs. That's another example of where the Treasury have recognised a challenge and are investing to save to make sure that we're getting on the right track. But it's also...
And those are protected departments, whereas obviously you, unfortunately, MHCLG is not. So we get those extra appointments, we get people out of hospital, they don't have homes to go to.
Well, that's why we are investing in homes as well, and the NHS money that the health service money has also had an impact on things like adult social care, for example. So more money is going into adult social care. So there's a cross-government working to make sure that we deal with some of the challenges, because the NHS is spending more money on keeping people in hospital and on hospital trolleys because we don't have the social care in place. So the work we're doing with the Department for Health is about making sure that we have the home care services and the support in the community to stop people getting to a crisis point, which will ultimately give better outcomes and save money.
Okay.
Treasury recognise that.
Well.
So one of the issues that local councils screaming out for money on is on special educational needs. The Chairman's already highlighted we fear more Section 114s are on their way, but we as MPs hear from parents all the time of the poor quality SEND services out there. They just don't feel they're getting a fair deal for their child. And with the white paper on its way, that's obviously a cross-departmental paper, can you assure the committee that councils will be properly funded for the SEND services they need to deliver, and that no SEND child will lose out as a result?
Well, we're absolutely clear that the legal right for additional support is absolutely the right thing to do, and that SEND children need that support. And as somebody who's been through that system very recently, I understand what the holy grail of the HCP plan, even though it has its limitations. I understand why parents are really concerned, even though that doesn't still deliver what parents want for their children. I understand why there is concern about that. We have to make sure that children with special educational needs and disability have the support in place, and we will absolutely make sure that that white paper is about ensuring that we get that. Huge sums of money is going in to SEND, but the outcomes are not getting better. So something has to change, and what we're trying to do is to collaborate to find what is working, what isn't working, and how do we make the system work better. So the DFE have been working really closely with the Department for Health, because again, that's the synergy, even though you might have an EHCP plan, the synergy of that and accessing services isn't as joined up. So we're working across government to how we can have better outcomes for those children and to guarantee them the support that they need at the moment. And that support, unfortunately, isn't always there now. You have to wait years just to get an identity of a challenge, and that's way too long for children and young people. If their needs are not being met in the earliest stage, then that has worse outcomes for them for their whole life, and therefore we have to fix the system and get people in the system in a way that delivers for those young people, and we're really clear on that as a government. And the system is broken. As I said, MPs from across the House mention this to the Prime Minister every single week, and we're determined to get this right, because these are vulnerable children who deserve better, and we deserve more value for money, because we're putting more money than ever in there, and the outcomes are not getting better for those young people, and we have a duty to make sure that they're looked after and supported throughout life.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. I actually agreed with what you said, but you didn't fully answer my question, so I want to push, if that's okay. EHCPs, you said there'll still be a legal right to EHCPs, which I thought was great, but you didn't say that no SEND child wouldn't lose out, and you certainly didn't comment on actually councils would be properly financed to deliver the services we want them to do. Can you answer the two final questions,
Sure.
please?
I mean, I think the challenge we've given you a carte blanche, yes, is that the system at the moment doesn't support those children. I would argue that the system at the moment, if you can't get an EHCP or it takes you 7 years to get one, there's many children at the moment that are not getting the support they need. So my hesitation is not to try and say those with an EHC plan will not get the support that they need. Now, they clearly will, but there is a whole group of young people who are not getting the support that they need, and that's my honest hesitation to you. You know me, I'm a straight talking politician. It's not that I'm saying, oh, we're going to hold off. Actually, we need to do much more. Now, that could be around early intervention, the work that we've this week announced around the new hubs, family hubs, about making sure we identify need early on, and that we're providing that support for children and families throughout the whole of the child's life. So those that are on EHCP at the moment, of course, there will always be a legal right for their additional support, but I think there's a category of children and young people that are outside of that programme at the moment whose parents are despairing because there is a child that is in need, but that need isn't being met, and that's why we've got to reform the system to pick it up earlier and to deliver for around those young people's needs. So that's my hesitation. I'm not trying to hoodwink you on yes, no. It's just that it's a more complex picture than just children with EHCP, for example.
Okay, just mindful of time, if we could move on a bit, please. Just moving on to temporary accommodation, Nashaba.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State. Just want to go back to temporary accommodation, specifically looking at procurement. Obviously, we understand as a committee that the Ministry is still in live policy development around the issue, and in respect of how to carry out the recommendations that were made by the Office for Value for Money study on the procurement of temporary accommodation, could you just give us a bit of a flavour about what discussions are currently taking place in respect of the live policy development?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was fair to say, I think your report was, your comments was that we'd not given you enough detail, but one of the challenges that we felt when we was responding to some of the report was that we, of course, was trying to respond ahead of the spending review, which makes a bit difficult to give you full details when, of course, we was in a live discussion about that. But now that we've got the 39 billion investment in social and affordable homes and the 950 million investment for the fourth round of local authority housing programme, we have a much clearer understanding, and we've launched the emergency accommodation reduction pilots, which I think is welcomed in 20 local authorities who have the highest levels of B&B use, and we've put more money into homeless prevention grant to support some of the work that we're trying to do as well. So we're already doing we've completed 3 of the committee's 7 recommendations already, and we're taking them forward. But the challenge for us at the time was that we didn't quite have a full picture of where we were landing at the SR, if I'm as blunt as that.
And then in addition to those points on the on our response to the committee's report, the specific set of recommendations that the Office for Value for Money made are all about taking a more local approach to procuring short-term residential accommodation. We absolutely kind of see the value in that, and indeed it builds on some of the work that the Deputy Prime Minister referenced earlier on the sort of 100 million on test and learn pilots, which have looked at the way that councils procure temporary accommodation and trying to improve it. So we do want to look at that in the round and how to take it forward, but it's quite a complex system, so it might take a little bit of time before we can say precisely how.
And thank you, I appreciate that, and I appreciate what you're saying about that localised approach. As someone who was a former councillor, I recognise the value of that and what it means. However, what is the support that's going to be given to councils to be able to kind of navigate that? Because at the minute it does feel like the system is very much a case of grab what you can get. And it doesn't seem to be working, and it also leads to a wider problem around out-of-borough placements as well. So looking at some of those recommendations, and given the urgency of this, do you know what that might look like in the short term, not just the longer term? Because I think the urgency is now. Yeah,
so we do a number of things at the moment to support local government, local authorities on their response on homelessness. We have homelessness advisory support teams that work with local government in order to identify where there's good practice and less good practice. And a good example of that is on reduction of B&Bs, where we work very intensively, pairing up councils where they have managed to either eliminate or massively reduce the amount of use of B&B accommodation for families with those that are working to try and achieve that. So that is a system that is currently in place. But I think kind of considering both the things that we've learned from those temporary accommodation test and learn pilots and from the Office for Value for Money's studies, we'll want to set out more in the homelessness strategy later this year about how we would want to see the overall procurement of temporary accommodation improving, becoming better for value for money, and also being higher quality temporary accommodation rather than a default to B&B accommodation, which we recognise the kind of significant impact that has on children and families.
Just picking up on that point, obviously you've mentioned children. I think the record number of children that are classified as homeless living in temporary accommodation is something that I recognise that we all know needs to be addressed urgently. Is there any work being done in that area specifically?
Well, we gave additional funding, first of all, and as I mentioned before, we launched the emergency accommodation reduction pilots, which was specifically targeting 20 local authorities with some of the highest levels of B&B use. So we've put additional funding in and are trying to make sure that funding reaches the areas that we want to, and the spending review settlement builds on the uplift that we've given. So again, we're putting record annual investment into homelessness, and that has been protected, and we've ring-fenced also around homelessness prevention, as well as putting money in the system to prevent us using Airbnbs, etc. Through local authorities. We also recognise that we need to get upstream of that problem, so even the stuff around the renters' rights and ending no-fault evictions will be incredibly important to the programme that we're trying to address the root cause of, and we know Section 21 evictions have been one of the root causes for homelessness, where families have been evicted. I gave you the example before where in some of the worst cases families have been evicted for no reason, and then the rent gets whacked up and somebody will take it. And that's especially when you're looking at some of the people who are in receipt of housing support, for example, and that's not a situation we need to be in going in the future.
One final question, if that's okay. I think it's just probably something that we've mentioned already within the committee, but it does feel like the live policy development phase has dragged on for a bit too long. And I just wanted to understand what is still being negotiated that's preventing the ministry from perhaps acting urgently on the crisis.
I mean, I suppose I'd sort of point to some of the things the Deputy Prime Minister set out that we've done kind of while doing further policy development in this area, and then also point to the fact that the spending review wasn't very long ago, and that therefore obviously some of this is about how we use the funding that's being provided, whether it's funding specifically for homelessness prevention, whether it's indeed some of the changes that we're making to local authority funding in order to rebalance and use temporary accommodation costs as part of the formula for allocating funding, and also looking at how we use, for example, the local authority housing fund where we managed to secure a fourth round of that, and the distribution of it in order to address some of those locally based solutions to temporary accommodation that we talked about. So I mean, you know, obviously kind of it would be, I mean, a little bit like the leasehold reform. You know, we could have set out some plans earlier, but actually like the amount of work that we've done subsequently and the information that we have now will mean that the strategy that we do produce, I hope, will be longer lasting and have greater impact.
Do you think it's enough, though, given the immediate crisis that we've got at the minute with this issue?
I mean, I think kind of clearly we recognise the scale of the crisis and have also done other things to try and like prevent it not only having the impact that it's had in terms of temporary accommodation funding and the pressures that that's put on councils, but also try to improve outcomes for families and children in particular, because I mean I completely recognise what you've said about the numbers of children in temporary accommodation in particular and how much they've grown just in recent times.
Yeah.
Just briefly, obviously the temporary accommodation crisis is everywhere, but we know in London it's 4 million a day for local councils, it's one kid in every classroom. We all want fair funding, but we know under the proposals money will be coming out of London councils. So what assurance can you give us that temporary accommodation pressures and crucially looking at deprivation after housing costs, that we'll be using accurate data to inform what we all want, which is a fairer settlement? As you pointed out previously, it was very politicised and that was very unfortunate. But can you give an assurance that we're going to be using data that includes things like temporary accommodation costs to make that decision?
Yeah, I mean, we have published what we think is a way of capturing deprivation, because I think one of the other challenges, and this is a challenge for inner London in particular, where some areas that were considered very affluent, and you'll know this as a local MP, there are pockets of significant deprivation that would be lost under previous calculations. What we're trying to do in the consultation that we're doing in terms of the fair funding review is to capture that. So we're trying to capture that, as well as the point I made to Mr Dillon earlier around the tackling issues for rural areas as well, which have particular challenges. So if you look at the consultation exercise that we're doing, we're hopeful, and we're still after feedback on that. We're hopeful actually that we will capture that more readily in a way that hasn't been done before. And I would say that your borough in particular is one where you would see some very stark inequalities and some pockets of real deprivation at the same time as some pockets of real wealth and affluency.
Just coming back to the issue of the temporary accommodation and procurement, Secretary of State and Permanent Sec. Obviously, you'll be aware that some of the frustrations from colleagues in that, in a sense, the ministry is essentially bidding for properties at the same time the Home Office are bidding for properties, and that you've got the market and developers and landlords driving the price up, which costs the taxpayer and everyone else more money. The Local Government Association reckon that they've spent up to £7 million, and there's a massive gap in what they've spent on temporary accommodation. Councils have spent across the country versus what they've received back from the department in terms of that shortfall. That again feeds into some of the funding pressures that we're outlining. I don't need to tell you the figures that London is spending on temporary accommodation a day, £4 million. All of that continues to go up on a daily basis. Again, we know that the ultimate aim and goal is to build those homes. Yeah. But in terms of some of the recommendations which we felt as a committee were helpful to help the department in addressing that in the interim, I think we were quite disappointed that a number of those recommendations were discarded, were not even looked at, were not something that, you know, the ministry said maybe they'd look at them and come back and deal with that. I just wanted to know if you had any updates on some of the clear recommendations where we were trying to help the department on some of the key pressures, which is eating into the money that you're putting into local government, coming back out on the other side in TA pressures.
Yeah, I think you're right to identify that government departments compete with each other, which adds to the pressure. We've identified that. So my department and the Home Office are working with local government to test new locally led models for things like asylum at the same time. We also speak to the Ministry of Justice, who again buy properties up as we have prison release. That's another pressure. We're speaking to other departments who have land that could be utilised, so MOD, we're speaking to health, we're speaking to transport. We've seen some real good initiatives around land assembly where metro mayors who have got powers have been utilising them, and we're taking lessons from that. But I think, Chair, you're absolutely right to raise the issue of different departments in silos competing with each other and then adding to the pressures, and we've been having a sort of cross-government approach to it. So some of the work that I've been doing again around community cohesion, which I like to think of as actually building strong communities, is working across government about how do you build strong communities, and that's about making sure that those pressures are recognised and that facilities, whether that's health, housing, transport, or whatever it is that the government is doing, which it comes as full circle back to the Green Book and sort of placed approach to things, is in a more joined up way and delivers to build strong communities. And at the moment our current procurement, government procurement, doesn't deliver that. So you'll see the work the Cabinet Office is doing around government contracting and procurement, around social value, and you'll see the cross-departmental work that we're trying to do at the moment so that we don't compete with each other to end up spending more money and competing in the same areas, and to be fair then adding particular pressure points in particular areas. And the way in which we do that, it's not only working cross-government, but we've been really clear, and I think the Cabinet accept that local government is key to that as well.
So they will accept then that it's not right that 23-24 collectively local government spent 2.29 billion on temporary accommodation. So if we had maybe a process in place to maybe review and inspect temporary accommodation before we place vulnerable families, including vulnerable children, in the same set of accommodation, it would help. They would also maybe look at the issue of local housing allowance to help those families not being evicted. I'm just looking at how we can help the department in terms of the key pressures, day-to-day pressures, which will not go away, Secretary of State, and you know this.
Yeah. I mean, again, the Child Poverty Task Force, again, is looking in the round of some of the wider pressures, but I would say some of the work that I've been overseeing from my Office of Deputy Prime Minister around communities and building stronger communities, which the late John Prescott, who had my role before me, had a real emphasis on this. And I've been pulling the government on this issue around outcomes for communities, which touches on some of these issues and some of the pressures, the pull and push of why communities are struggling. And some of it is around deep-seated poverty, some of it is around services, and some of it is around lack of investment and joined up investment around place that can really drive. And at the end of all of that, and I'm looking at it from a stronger communities perspective, but it's also about economic growth for areas who have been held back. So there is a joined up approach from myself, the Treasury and the rest of Cabinet that recognises for areas to reach their full potential, you have to look at these issues, and you have to look at what the government is doing that inadvertently makes that worse, as well as what the government can do to alleviate some of those pressures. And local authorities are key to recognising these challenges, and to be fair, have been raising these challenges, but I've not necessarily always had a seat around the table with the right person to make it out.
I hope we will be listening to local authorities going forward.
Absolutely. I put them at the heart of what we do. I think that, I mean, I'm a creature of local government. I represented local government workers. I worked in there for decades, and I think they, you know, if you look at any business in the private sector, if they'd had the reductions that local government have had at the same time as the challenges that local government have had and the changes that they've had to implement that local government have had, I think that most businesses wouldn't have been able to cope with that. Local government have done an exceptional job under very difficult circumstances because of the external and you know, internal pressures that they faced.
Maya.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions just about sort of the broader spending review decision making, and then just one big one, I guess, around devolution. So just on the spending review itself, so what trade-offs did the ministry make in negotiating its spending review settlement with HM Treasury?
Well, I wouldn't say it was a trade-off that we were doing. We did our own zero-based review very early on when I took over the department. We conducted a line-by-line review to ensure that every pound that taxpayers' money is spent on the priorities. So we reprioritised a lot of the budget significantly and then did what we consider to be poor value for money programmes like the new homes bonus. Our admin budgets, we're committed to delivering the savings of 15%. We'd already done some work on that by prioritising in-house government lawyers, for example, over expensive external legal expertise and ensuring that the workforce was agile. And we've also identified 50 million in efficiencies by 28-29 through significant workforce and digital reform. We've been working very much with Peter Cowell's team on AI and improving productivities. There's some real good work that we could do on things like planning, for example, that if we digitalise would really help. And also on the cladding and remediation, which has been quite clunky, if we could get systems that are more streamlined. So I think that actually we're leading the way across Whitehall in simplifying and also making sure that we're getting the best value for money. And that also leads on to the work that we've been doing with local government, and that was around the different pots that are ring-fenced, trying to bring them together and have better outcomes. And you'll have seen my announcements on that. I think it was earlier this week at local government conference or last week. I can't remember. They all days merge into one. But yeah, it wasn't that long ago that I outlined that. But this is about making sure that we're getting the best value and that we're putting the money where we need it most. But we can't get away from the fact that we inherited a really difficult situation. But I think you can see that the government has prioritised what we said we were going to do, and we've been protecting especially all of the nations and areas and focusing the area where we think we can really make a big difference, where places haven't really felt that investment before. I said that I felt levelling up was a sham and a scam. And I think that, you can put hanging baskets somewhere, but if you don't really drive some of the economic and the challenges that areas face, if the transport connectivity, the connections isn't there, then you're not going to get the investment to real drive that growth and give people real opportunities. And that's what we're doing across government with the overall spending review and the investments, the huge amount of investments that the Treasury announced in the spending review.
You touched a little bit there on how you've been working with the departments. How well do you feel that mission-led government is working, given that you are holding a core part of a lot of the legislation changes, and what opportunities do you think there are to improve that working going forward?
I think it's been really good. It's challenging because every day you've got a zillion and one things to do. So my colleagues who have been in government before will recognise this, that getting the opportunity to meet and discuss and then and understand those priorities can be challenging. But I can genuinely say that where I've found difficulty, so for example, building the homes and the planning infrastructure bill is so much more than my department. I needed the Treasury to look at the things that needed to be done around investment. I needed DEFRA to look at the infrastructure problems on reservoirs, on things to do with nature recovery. I needed transport to deliver the transport. I needed health to deliver the health packages in those areas. And they have been incredibly supportive. And I think having that plan for change and those key milestones of a government sort of bought us all into them being key priorities. So yes, you do your day-to-day job and you definitely need to make sure you do it, but you also have to understand that our key marker and key landing zone is our plan for change and those key targets that we set ourselves, and we're all committed to that. So each department, like the Department of Health, their key targets, or the department, the Home Office, half in violence against women and girls, that cannot be delivered through the Home Office. It has to be delivered through, we've done a lot of work on things like taking down some of the barriers for people who are fleeing domestic violence in presenting as homelessness or needing rehouse, and the locality test. So these things that we're doing cross-government that I think is working really well. I think the challenge to it is that just the day-to-day work of what you do often can silo you. So therefore having those missions, I think, has been critical to us keeping that as a checkpoint for us.
Thank you. And then just on devolution, you quoted the Chancellor earlier saying that she wants growth across the whole of the UK. You talked about building communities. As a kind of, a rural MP, I'm incredibly grateful for those recognitions in the fair funding formula to support rural areas. As a Northern MP, I'm incredibly grateful for the Green Book changes and sort of that focus on devolution to the north. That said, it does feel like those areas that don't have mayor or combined authorities and arguably that aren't urban areas are still not being prioritised. And so I guess my question to you is, do you think this government, and especially our Treasury, value our rural and county areas in the same way that the British people do? And what are you and your department doing to build that sort of intangible value of kind of what matters to us as a country, which I think focuses a lot around those sort of county and rural areas, into our economic planning and the focus for this country's future?
I think that's a really important question, and as you say, the expansion of devolution through our devolution priority programme will have up to 8.8 million more people through that programme. And it's important to say that what that does is deliver them more powers. So we're doing work already in filling the gap for mayoral combined authorities, which I said before, and we've got 6 new places that are going to be covered by that. And this is about a consistent set of powers. We're asking local authorities to do more in terms of how they work with each other on things. So this isn't about leaving places behind. This is about us saying that Westminster doesn't always know best. So what we're trying to do is push power down to the people that want it, that can deliver it, so that the question mark around transport, health, employment, that has always been traditionally held centrally, is being pushed down. So there is greater amounts now. It's staged, so people who have metro mayors have different powers. We're trying to, through our new bill that will be coming forward soon, what we're trying to do is expand devolution so that people have more powers and more skin in the game to change things in their local areas. But notwithstanding the support we're giving to local authorities at the moment, with the extra funding and working with people like the LGA and building capacity in my department to give them more support to deliver services that they already have the powers at the moment. But what's fair to say, and I think this sometimes gets missed, is that somehow you're not going to get it. It's we're trying to give more power in an area, so it's not about those being left behind. What we're trying to do is say we want to give you more control over things that are happening in your area, and things like transport, things like skills is bigger than a local authority boundary, it's bigger than a council. So we're trying to create structures to devolve that down so that they can have more control over those areas.
Do you recognise that there's still a sense that certainly from the sort of the Treasury's thinking that they're still focused on agglomeration, so that there's kind of devolution to the sort of urban areas and city areas, but that still those surrounding kind of more county areas, more dispersed areas aren't necessarily going to benefit from that, and that we maybe need a bit more leadership to say, actually, what is what's our vision for those areas that's not just focused on those key cities around the country?
So I recognise the frustration. My gentle pushback a little bit is that we're finding our voice more. And I say that as a northern, working class MP, that if you look at where we were 30 years ago to where we are now, the transformation that devolution, this is why I'm a big advocate of devolution is, if you look at where we are now compared to where we were 30 years ago, it was always the Secretary of State that was making these decisions for areas like Lancaster or Manchester or, areas that feel totally left behind. So I feel like the powers are coming, they're not coming at the rate and pace that some may want, because we've got to have accountability within that, and we saw some of that stripped away previously, and we see how that can be difficult and cause challenges. But I'm optimistic that we're getting there, and I feel people's frustration. But one of the memorable moments for me was during the pandemic when Greater Manchester was told we're not getting as much support for furlough as other parts of the country, and we had a Manchester mayor that was able to stand up and say Manchester wants, and that combined power of that mayoral approach was able to deliver that. We've got buses coming back into public ownership. We wouldn't have had that had we have not had the devolution agenda. So I absolutely believe that we can deliver devolution, and we can support areas that maybe are not as far down that track. They're not losing anything. They're just in the same spot as they were before, with Westminster talking directly to them and through their MPs as well, who are great advocates for their area, and they will not be left behind, but they just won't get as much devolution as they would do if they don't combine by working together, because it's just impossible to be able to deliver that at a sort of council level. So you need to have this combined approach, or you have to have a sort of mayor approach that will deliver practically to devolve those powers down.
Just on that, we share your optimism, Deputy Prime Minister, and do you agree that maybe in the future there'll be optimism and support for fiscal devolution, which is what local authorities continue to cry out for, to help them in terms of place shaping? They know their areas best, they know where those funding pressures continue to come from, and they know how to spend that money locally. But the key omission in the government's devolution agenda is the fiscal devolution. Do you agree on that?
So I smile because you goad me. I think the challenge is it's always a bit evolution and revolution, and I'm definitely want to see more push. We have had that. To be fair, there is more fiscal devolution coming to some of our Pathfinder mayors. They're getting more control over their budgets. More departments are pushing more down. We're unring-fencing huge sums of money to local government at the moment, which has never been done before. Councils get a pot of money and they're told how to spend it. I think that's very disrespectful. I think if you've got outcomes, councils want to deliver on those outcomes as well. So I'm challenging the system. Everyone says about Westminster, but I like to think that actually if you empower local leaders, if you give them the resources to face the challenges and you support them in that endeavour, my style of leadership is that you get the best outcomes from that. And I believe that working in that approach, it doesn't matter what council's political stripes are, what mayors it is, the challenges, they need to achieve an outcome because they have an electorate as well. So the challenges are the same. So I absolutely believe that we should be pushing more. But equally, the note of caution that comes our way as well is that sometimes where there has been the brakes taken off, so for example in local government where local audit was taken away, councils have found themselves in hot water, and therefore there has to be a balance and some guardrails, and that's why we announced as part of our package that we're doing is how we can support councils and support the robust audit process, as well as how we can support them in terms of finances being pushed towards them with more freedom.
Again.
Thank you. My question is to actually Dame Sarah Healey. Firstly, congratulations on your gong. It's about people that are just about managing. Does the department liaise with local councils about those that are not yet touching the system? We all appreciate councils are very much the coalface of services to our community. And if they are tracking those that are not yet touching the system but may very well likely to, with above inflation council tax rises, utility prices still being high, cost of living more generally, and if they are tracking it, how is that influencing policy creation and the recommendations you're giving to Secretary of State?
So, I mean, we liaise with local councils on pretty much everything that local councils do because, you know, part of the purpose of the department is to be the sort of conduit of issues that local government is experiencing. You're partly talking about whether the department has speaks to councils about how to do better preventative work, I think, and actually identify groups that might become more vulnerable and need additional harm. I think we all understand some of the challenges that local government has had in investing in prevention over recent years, simply because of the scale of sort of crisis response that they've had to engage in, whether it's in temporary accommodation, whether it's in adult social care, whether it was in children's social care, hence all of the reforms that the Deputy Prime Minister sort of talked about. Obviously, councils have some responsibility where it comes to cost of living and ensuring that kind of some additional needs are met. But we have worked with other government departments quite extensively on trying to ensure that where we can fund prevention and help people not get into the pipeline of becoming more vulnerable, we can do so. Hence, for instance, what we've done with the Homelessness Prevention Grant, making sure that 49% of it is focused specifically on prevention and not necessarily diverted to dealing with the costs of failure. But all of our conversations with local government, all of our understanding of the population pressures that they're dealing with inform the advice that we give to ministers on next steps.
So can I just add one of the things, the stronger communities, which I'm really, as Deputy Prime Minister, I'm really keen on. We've been also mapping data across all different data points, whether it's deprivation, whether it's cost of living, points of how much people are paying out X, Y and Z, so that we could, and there's a lot of overlap with some of the challenges that particular areas face. So again, then trying to have a whole government approach to tackling that, which is not just about those that are in the most deprived and challenging, but some of the other areas that people face in their lives. So for example, particular cohort, women in particular end up out of the workplace for various reasons, either caring responsibilities or over 50s, women in particular find it difficult. So some of the measures we're trying to achieve through the Employment Rights Bill was about rebalancing that so that people can stay in the workforce, and therefore that in effect is a preventative measure because then people can maintain their living standards. So there's a number of different factors. Health, there's particular interesting patterns in health inequalities and some of the challenges that particular people face as well. So trying to, as technology advances, trying to use that data to overlap and have a much more holistic picture around what makes community stronger. And I'm in particular, I'm very interested in how we get ahead of that and build stronger communities. And building stronger communities is not just about one particular group, it's about the whole of the community. You have to have an ecosystem that delivers for the whole community within that, which is a challenge when you look at government policy, but it's something that I'm keen to do.
And I think also I'd point to the fair funding review again in terms of sort of the fact that removing ring fences on funding gives councils greater freedom to identify people who might be in need and take that whole community approach, and a reassessment of need means more of the money is getting to the places where actually there is likely to be a pipeline of need, and so those councils will have more resources to be able to intervene earlier.
Just on intervention and discussions with councils, Dame Sarah, do you and your staff go out and visit councils?
Yes.
And look at conditions of stuff like temporary accommodation and things like that?
Yes, I mean, I visited some temporary accommodation that had been condemned as a Category 1 hazard in Blackpool, which is something I saw which, you know, you really just couldn't forget.
Can't unsee. Yeah. Very mindful of time, members. If you're very quick with your questions, please. Lewis, Lee.
I'll try and be very quick. Deputy Prime Minister, on council tax, at the moment the system is it's collected and spent locally. Have you had any discussions across government around it being collected in one area and spent in another?
Not necessarily council tax spent in one area and collected in another. Obviously, the way in which grant funding applies to councils. The fair funding review is looking at obviously how much a council can raise, for example, through their other forms of expenditure as opposed to how much need that they've got in an area, and that's a prudent way of doing it. But it's not about how we can, to coin a phrase, rob Peter to pay Paul. It's about actually how much grant funding is required and how much need is there in their communities and how much those councils can provide at least those statutory services for people. I think that's my fairest way of answering that. I see where you're going with it, but I dispute that as a way in which to characterise what we're trying to do. I made it clear we need to fund councils on the basis of need, and I'm determined to do that. And I think that most people would understand that, and that's what we're trying to achieve with our fair funding review, which the previous government promised and then never delivered in the years that they had. They didn't do that, and I think that was regressive, and it's left a lot of councils on the brink with no reserves, barely any reserves, because they've been having to fund statutory services out of their reserves, desperately trying to plug the deprivation gaps that they have that haven't been addressed.
Lee, very quickly, please.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of engaging with the local councils, Sarah, have you heard of any concerns about SIL payments? So there are certain councils across the country now that have been refunding SIL payments where residents have made a technical error on their form. I wondered if the department or the ministry was able to issue a statement or some best guidance around that, or happy to follow it up outside of here as well.
In fact we did a Public Accounts Committee hearing that covered this issue on SIL last week, so we can point you to what we said about it there. Obviously it's council's discretion whether to take account of the fact that somebody's made an error, but we do indicate that it's appropriate for them to use that flexibility in some circumstances.
Thank you. Thanks.
Joe, and then Andrew, and then Mike.
Yeah, just one thing you've announced since the spending review was some reforms to the building safety regulator. I've been really worried that there's this kind of false choice narrative developing about post-Grenfell safety requirements versus speed. Could you just explain how those reforms you think will help avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been really clear that we have to, first of all, implement the recommendations that came from phase 1 and phase 2 of the Grenfell inquiry, which was around a single regulator. Some of the changes we've made recently on the building safety regulator, with Andy Rowe taking up as the interim chair, I think leader of that, is about making sure that we drive those changes. But at the forefront of our mind is about safety. That the previous government introduced some of the legislation that provided us with the regulator, but the regulator clearly wasn't being able to work at pace and deliver the requirements. And as we've got further in that process, we recognise that, and that's why we propose the changes that we've made. But I want to reassure yourself, your constituents and everybody else that I read the Grenfell report and it is absolutely horrifying. And safety will not be. I will not, as a Secretary of State, in good conscience, measure safety against any other of our priorities, because we have to learn the lessons of the past, and we could have prevented Grenfell and we didn't.
Thank you, Chair. The New Towns Commission is a really important piece of work. We had Sir Michael Lyons before us a few weeks ago, and I proud to represent the two best new towns in the country, in Hatfield and Welwyn Garden City, and I have a colleague from Milton Keynes who might dispute that, but he's not here today. Absolutely. But obviously it's crucial to how we build communities for the 21st century. We had a great session with Michael. He had previously talked about a report being published in July, but we saw a letter which didn't mention July. Is that still the planned timetable, and if not, how quickly will we see his recommendation?
I'm expecting it imminently from the task force. I mean, they've done a fantastic job, and thank you to Sir Michael and his team. I expect them to come forward very soon with their recommendations, and for us to take that forward. And New Towns, I think you're obviously a fan of them, have been incredibly important in terms of how we build communities. And we've seen some really good examples of that, and we want to be able to take that programme forward, but we will have to look at what the recommendations are. I haven't had them yet, but I'm looking forward to them coming past my desk before the end of summer.
Lewis wants 5.
No, very quickly.
I was just really pleased to hear your enthusiasm then about data and building that capacity within the department. And just a quick question, because I've raised in the chamber before how surprised I am in responses to many written questions that I've made in the first year of being in government of how little data we have. So I just wondered to what extent you already report on or could possibly report to this committee about like how you're shifting the use of data and what kind of strengths you're building around that space, because I think any kind of dashboard and monitoring that we can look at, particularly when you're looking at the different levels of government and that communication between them, data is so critical. So just interested in what infrastructure you're putting in place to make use of that, I guess.
So I have a delivery team that I pull together from people within the department that reports to me, and we look at how we can pull the data and how it means something. I mean, I'm all for a graph, and I hate spreadsheets where I'm trying to look all over the place to find something. So as the Secretary of State, it drives me mad if I can't find the outcome that is a human outcome when it's on an analogue like Excel sheet. So there's a lot of work that we've been doing to cross the data over, because otherwise you're only getting a one-dimensional view of the overall impact. So I can speak to the Permanent Secretary and see what we could do to try and provide you with some of the data that we've been doing and some of the delivery models that we're modelling at the moment to make sure that I don't miss my key targets, because I keep an eye on it on a monthly basis. So.
And just a quick follow-up of that, and I appreciate you might not have the answer to it now, but I'm aware that in Lancashire, I believe about 10 years ago, we used to have a data and insights team of about 80 staff, and that was cut through previous cuts. And
I don't have 80.
No. Like,
just to clarify, no way that they fit in my office.
My question being is that where we know that local authorities have been cut to the bone, that data is so valuable, but presumably the response back at the moment will be how do we put that capacity in? So just interested in potentially for a future update, or is how are we supporting local authorities where we are demanding more of them in terms of data, because we know how valuable that will be to our strategic planning nationally, how we're going to support them to make sure they have the capacity to sort of build that data.
Yeah, we're doing some particular areas around planning, for example. We're doing quite a lot of work with them and around digitalising. You'll have seen the work we did, because buying a property and some of the way in which you have to go about getting some of the information you need, most house sales fall through because this information is still quite difficult to get. So we've been doing some work in particular around land registry and planning, etc. But I'm sure that we can write to you with some information about how we're trying to, not just my department pull together how we use data, but how the government is trying to use data and take advantage of new technologies now, and how we can provide efficiencies within that and be able to cross-examine data from different data points. It can be tricky, because certain data doesn't always match the same data. It's not apples and apples, it's apples and pears, or it doesn't quite always synergy match up. But I think with new technology now, there's some really exciting ways to which we can map that data.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State Sarah Healey, for coming before us this afternoon. I think we covered quite a number of areas. I think it's fair to say we will continue to monitor the work from the department, rightly so, because we are concerned. And we want to see those homes being built for those children living in temporary accommodation, for the families who want to start their own families and getting their foot on housing ladder, for many leaseholders who continue to struggle with eye-watering bills. So these are key areas that we'll continue to monitor, and we look forward to seeing the new Towns Commission when that's launched. But thank you for coming this afternoon, both of you.
Thank you, Chair.
Order.